One of the weirdest things of all was there's an essay in the back, and Murata admits to it almost feels like ASMR in a book. What was the point of reading that? What is up, guys? Welcome back to another video. In a slightly different setup today. It's super gloomy, so I'm a little bit closer to the window, but we still have the books back here on display. So don't pay attention to any messes that might be back there. I hope you guys had a good reading month for March. I ended up reading 6 books this month, 2 audiobooks, and then I have 4 physical books here to talk about. And I did read several for my Reading Around the World challenge, so that's always good because as I always say, it's gonna take me probably a couple of years to get through this challenge. So any month where I can read like multiple in a month is a pretty good month. If I'm out of focus the whole time, hopefully at least the books will be in focus. Okay, so the first book of the month was Minor Detail by Damien Sebe. This checked the box for Palestine for my Reading Around the World challenge. So this is quite a slim little novel, as you can tell. It's like not even 120 pages, and it's split into 2 parts. So the first part follows an Israeli soldier, or he's like a general, I think. He's like a little bit above. He's in charge of like a troop of soldiers. We're just kind of following him, like his day to day. He gets bit by a spider really early on, and we see him like bandage the wound. And just literally like his day-to-day. Like, honestly, the writing was it was kind of slow paced. It was very like, I had times where I was like, why are we just following him around? And it doesn't really seem like there's a lot of purpose to it. It almost felt like just kind of a slice of life, like following him around the camp. And basically what they are there for is to catch any people who are just like wandering in the desert. They're on patrol for any like Palestinian people who might be coming through. And that's exactly what happens. We have a young Bedouin woman, a Palestinian woman. She's supposed to be, I don't know exactly how old she's supposed to be. It just says young woman. And so you're going to want to check your content warnings for this one. It does get pretty graphic, so you can probably guess kind of what happens when she falls into the hands of these Israeli soldiers. And so that is kind of the whole point of part 1. That's the whole plot, is just like they find her and then we kind of, see what happens to her. And then part 2 takes place like 25 years later, and we meet a whole new character, and she becomes obsessed with the detail of the crime. Because it took place on her birthday 25 years before. So she like gets obsessed with this crime that she reads about in the paper, and feels like she has to go explore and find out more about what happened. And it says in one of the reviews, which I didn't necessarily pick up on this, but she is supposed to be on the spectrum. She's supposed to be autistic. And I guess that's why she kind of becomes so obsessed with this particular crime. And then the ending for this, which I think was kind of like suggested or like warned about in one of the reviews that I read, is very like abrupt and unexpected, and kind of, it's one of those endings that like makes you rethink everything that you just read. And it's like very jarring. So anyway, be prepared for that. But this is about war. It's about violence, memory, and narratives that kind of get buried with time. The writing was very simple, and I've read reviews that say it's deceptively simple, meaning like it's actually doing a lot more than what you realize. But it is a very easy read in terms of just the writing style. It's not an easy read in terms of the content, so just be aware of that. I gave it 4 stars. It's saying something really important, but I will say it's probably gonna hit the hardest if you are somebody who has lived life under occupation. Living in America, I'm American. This is not something that I've ever experienced, which is kind of the point of doing a Reading Around the World challenge, is to like feel like I'm living the lives of others, or kind of like expanding my worldview and stepping into somebody else's shoes. So that was Minor Detail. All right, and then the next book that I read was an audiobook I listened to on Spotify called Thrust by Lydia Yuknavitch. This was really interesting. This has been on my TBR for the longest time. I remember seeing this. I've seen this book in the bookshops for years. Honestly, there's so much to say about this book. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. It's incredibly well written. Like, it's very, very well written. but it's one of those books that is trying to say so much and is giving so many metaphors, and we're following so many different characters that it feels a bit meandering at times, which isn't my favorite type of like plot to follow. So our main character is a young girl who honestly we didn't really get a lot of time with. Her name is Lysve, and she has this she seemed also like she was on the spectrum, and she has this unique ability to travel in time using different objects, and it's set soon after like global warming has caused the sea to rise. And so the opening scene is like she's on a boat that is taking her out to tour the Statue of Liberty, but only the torch is visible, like the water has risen up to the torch. And we very quickly jump into other characters' heads. Like there's a lot of other characters that we're following. The audiobook was really interesting because they did use other voice actors, other narrators for those characters, which I appreciated. I think it would have been really difficult to follow if we hadn't had that. So that definitely makes it more kind of immersive. So I did like that aspect of the audiobook. And I'm honestly glad that I listened to it instead of just reading it for that reason. We're following the French sculptor who sculpted the Statue of Liberty. He has like his own chapters. We're following the iron workers whose job it was to piece her together. We're following the like cousin of the French sculptor who's like very feminist and very like a provocative woman of the time. We're following a young man who's accused of murder. I didn't really fully understand what the point of his character was. There was just a lot. There were quite a few characters who we were following, but I didn't really understand the point of why a lot of them were in the book, to the point where it felt like they were kind of just a conduit for the author to push her own thoughts and opinions. And I don't love that because it feels a little bit deceptive. I don't know, there's something about that I've never really enjoyed in books, where you kind of feel like, okay, this is just like this character is just a mouthpiece for the author to say what they think about the world. Lots of nihilistic thoughts about humanity. We actually get a couple of scenes from animal perspectives where we're hearing either their thoughts, or maybe they're really supposed to be talking animals. There's like a whale at one point. There's turtles who we get to hear the perspective of and their thoughts and emotions about what humans have done to them, to the natural world. I was just thinking we were gonna get more time with Lysve, who's an exceptionally unique character. I love like a young female protagonist trying to find her way in the world and navigate this very strange, dangerous new world in like the late 21st century. So the fact that we got so few chapters from her, and the chapters from all the other characters just felt, again, like they were just like philosophical wonderings, like philosophical musings about life, and I felt like we lost the plot. There's even like scenes between Frederick, the French sculptor, and Aurora, his cousin, the two I mentioned earlier. Intimate scenes between them and their cousins. And sure, there was once a point in time where that was the norm, but it's quite graphic, so you're gonna want to check content warnings. What was the point of reading that? You know? I feel like Lysve is such an interesting character. First of all, just her ability, her perspective on the world. I thought I was going to read about her, and we got maybe 10-20% of the book was about her. Overall, there's a sense of disappointment about this book. It just wasn't the book I thought it was going to be. It touches on some interesting themes, don't get me wrong. Like, it touches on environmental crisis and generational trauma and so many different like family dynamics. But the blurb did me dirty. The blurb claims that all these characters are what did it say? They're related in an intricate braid or something like that. And I felt like their connections were tenuous at best. Like they weren't solid, great, obvious connections. So anyway, that was Thrust. Next was one that had a pretty straightforward plot until you get to the end and things get very, very weird. And that is Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. I have read Convenience Store Woman by her and I really loved it. And so this one was sitting on my shelf and I was like, you know what? I just feel like I'm in the mood for something kind of strange. I have already read for Japan for my Reading Around the World challenge, but now I've read twice for it. Honestly, probably more than twice. I feel like I've read a lot of translated Japanese fiction. But anyway, this is very similar. We have a very unique female character. Her name is Natsuki. She does remind me of the female main character in Convenience Store Woman. Kind of that same, like, I don't really want to get married, I don't want to have kids, but societal pressures, family pressures, and there's tension there, a lot of family tension. I was not expecting like the level of abuse in this, like domestic abuse from her parents and then abuse from an older man. Definitely check your content warnings on this one. It was almost like Lolita vibes. Yeah, it was pretty graphic actually, to be honest. So definitely check this one. Like Storygraph does a really great content warning section, so you're gonna wanna check those out for this one. Anyway, Natsuki feels like she can hear the voice of this little hedgehog, her stuffed hedgehog animal, that she's had since she was a little girl. She basically can hear him speaking to her. She can hear him talking. He talks to her. And then aliens also come into it at one point in time. Very, very interesting. Weird, but wonderful. Weirdly wonderful. And then yes, the ending, I don't know that I was prepared for the ending. I don't want to say anything. It gets weird. It does get really weird. To the point where like some people it's going to repulse. So again, just check the content warnings for things like cannibalism. So yeah, that was Earthlings. I think I gave it 4 stars. It was a decent read. I don't know that it's one that I'll reread. I thought it was kind of an interesting meditation on the ways that we will deal with our trauma and the realities that we will create in order to process our trauma. These are the coping mechanisms. I didn't take it literally. One of the weirdest things of all was there's an essay in the back and Murata basically admits to having like these alien friends herself. Like she kind of admits to them being like her imaginary friends. What it sounds like is she's astral projecting. She basically admits to doing that every night with aliens. So I would love to be inside, or maybe terrified to be inside Sayaka Murata's mind. Apparently her fiction kind of stems from her own very strange and wonderful experiences. So anyway, that was Earthlings. Next up, I read for Norway again. This is Paradise Rot from Jenny Haval. It's just a very short, slim little novel. I loved this. This is like a quiet horror novel. There's some body horror, quite a few actually, body horror metaphors in here. We're following a main character named Jo, and she is a young Norwegian woman who has kind of transplanted from Norway to either the UK or America. I think it's the UK, like to study abroad at university. She sets it in like a fictional town, but I think it's supposed to be somewhere in the UK. And the only place that she is able to find to live is an abandoned warehouse that used to be a brewery that's barely livable. It's honestly not somewhere that people should be living, but there's already a woman living there. And so anyway, she ends up staying in this abandoned warehouse. We don't really get a lot of what's actually happening in her normal life at school. It almost all takes place at the warehouse. Her roommate's name is Carol, and she seems pretty normal, but as time goes on, it's like the house, well, it's not a house, it's a warehouse, but the warehouse kind of sucks her in and she seems to go a little crazy. Some of the things that happen are just like nonsensical. It almost feels like ASMR in a book. It's like the sounds really carry an echo in the warehouse, and so she has a lot of imagery in here that's like auditory imagery. I guess it's not imagery if it's auditory, but y'all know what I'm saying. Lots of descriptions of like sounds. The body horror kind of comes in because there's a lot of metaphors with fruit and rotting fruit in particular, and it relating to flesh. I found them really, really grotesque, but really fun to read if you like body horror. It's one of those books that kind of takes a setting, like it takes the warehouse and kind of makes it into this like grotesque monster, almost character in and of itself. So if you like books like that, almost like haunted house vibes, but not exactly. I feel like if you know that you have a strong stomach, then you'll be fine. But there are definitely some things in here that I can still picture very clearly in my mind because of how grotesque they were. So just be aware. There is a playlist for this that sounds really cool. I listened to just a couple of the songs. I totally could like vibe out to that playlist in the background while I was reading this. I didn't even think to look up a playlist before I started reading, but now you know that it exists. So if you read this, you might read the playlist or listen to the playlist alongside it. This I gave 4.5 stars. And then the last physical book that I read before I talk about the last audiobook was a Mary Oliver book of poems. This actually won a Pulitzer, but this is American Primitive. I am gonna go ahead and put the pretty cover up on the screen because that's the one I thought that I was receiving. This does not do Mary Oliver justice at all. I'm not sure what exactly they were thinking, but this is not it for her. Like, her poetry is too good. She just needs a little bit more color and vibrancy, and I feel like that's what the newer cover does. Yes, these are gorgeous. It's 50 poems. They mainly talk about nature. That's kind of what she's famous for, is like her nature poems. I've got a couple of favorites in here that I will put on the screen for you guys just because describing poetry is never the same as you just reading the poem. So I did give it 4.5 stars. August was one of my favorites, as well as Fall Song, and then part of John Chapman. So I'll go ahead and put August up on the screen and then Fall Song after it so you guys can kind of get the vibe. So those were two of my favorites. I wish I could say more. I'm really not. I was never like super into poetry. I feel like I never got it. And I know sometimes it's just about the words and how they make you feel. There's not supposed to be some super deep metaphor in every single line. But I feel like I can't, even though I have a bachelor's degree in English Lit, I feel like I can't really talk about poetry in a way that is like literary. I can't really talk about like its literary merits. I just know how it makes me feel. And I love it. It's so refreshing. It's one of those, it's like after spending like a couple of weeks in a city and then you finally take like a little sojourn out into like a forest or something and you're like, I needed this. Like, I just needed to take a minute and just like stop and pause and like listen to the bird song. You know what I mean? Like, it's, her poems feel like that in sort of like a rat race world. They're like a place where you can rest. So I highly recommend Mary Oliver. And then the last book that I read or listened to was an audiobook, and this was Julia by Sandra Newman. And it is a 1984 retelling from Julia's perspective. So of course it was a 5-star for me because I'm obsessed with 1984. It's one of my favorite books. I've talked about it before on my channel. I think I even donated a copy recently to one of you in my little haul, or my little like giveaway for like my 1,000 subscriber giveaway. If you haven't read 1984, I would read that before you read Julia, just because there's going to be some things like shorthand types of things and the political systems that exist within 1984. You're probably not really going to understand to the full extent if you don't read 1984 first. So I would honestly not read Julia unless you've read 1984. But it was absolutely fascinating to get a second perspective, because she is somebody who we spend a good deal of 1984 like thinking about, or at least Winston Smith, the main character of 1984, spends a great deal of time, you know, thinking about and being with. And so it was really interesting to get her side of things. I would love if there was like a book that combined the two of them and it was like a dual perspective, like every other chapter. That would be really cool to read, like what was happening in their lives simultaneously, and it'd be like one story. There was so much in there, honestly, that I was not expecting to read about. Like so many little details about like the anti-sex league that she's in, and like her day-to-day life, and just how that society functioned, and all the different, like, you can tell Sandra Newman has read 1984 and is obsessed with it, and has probably done a deep dive into the entire like world, because it does feel like we are back in that world. It doesn't feel like sort of a cheap knockoff retelling like some retellings feel like. It really feels authentic and genuine. I loved the narrator's voice. I feel like I've listened to her before, like her voice sounds kind of familiar, so I feel like I've probably heard another audiobook narrated by her. If 1984 is a book that like was required reading in school, or it just sounds boring to you or whatever, definitely give it another shot, because it's one of those books that it gets more and more accurate and more like our current society every passing year. I don't know how George Orwell was able to do that. He was just able to see, he was able to imagine so explicitly this police state, you know, this era of humans being surveyed all the time, you know, and like telescreens being able to see you just like you can see what's on the TV screen. So we're being surveyed. Siri is listening all the time. Even if you have her turned off, I turned her off. Now I'm just ranting, but I turned her off a couple months ago because I was like, well, maybe if she's not on, then she won't listen to me all the time. That's a whole other video. That's a whole other discussion. But it is a really important book to read, and I feel like that's one of the books that really truly is justified as a like required reading in school. So if you have somehow managed to miss 1984, you know, find an audiobook that you can listen to like on the way to school or work or whatever, because it's pretty mind-blowing and pretty scary. So anyway, I was obsessed with Julia, loved it, highly recommend if you're a fan of 1984. So that is it. That was all 6 that I read this month. You guys always, of course, give me recommendations for my Reading Around the World challenge, and then let me know in the comments some of the books that you read this month, or at least maybe your favorite, because who knows, it could be somebody else's favorite at some point in time. I have a couple of videos that I'm pretty excited for coming up soon. I've got like a short books recommendation video in case you're in a reading slump and you need to kind of get out of it. So that's coming soon. And then I've got one that I'm really excited about that has to do with Wednesday Addams. So I'm pretty pumped for that one. I've got a Medicine Park travel vlog coming out soon as well. So anyway, thank you guys so much for sticking through to the end, and I will see you in my next video. Bye guys. This may be the most precarious position that you have ever been in. Can y'all hear that truck? Thoughts about humanity, which is, Guillermo, get out of the cabinets.